It's a pleasure to be back and be with you again this morning, and just enjoy the wonderful worship here in this place. So thank you very much for having me. And I don't know if you may remember, but I've been here off and on over the last year or so at different times. Pastor Peter has invited me to come and share. And in the last couple of occasions that I have been here, I have focused on the aspect of our mission in work. That for us as Christians called to be salt and light in culture, one of the greatest opportunities I think that we have to demonstrate our faith is in the marketplace. I mean, it makes sense given the fact that we spend the majority of our waking hours are in the marketplace. That is the place where we spend the most of our time. That's probably the place where we have the most connections with other people. It stands to reason that our mission would be in the marketplace. And particularly, I think, in times such as these where people are less and less inclined to come to church, that we have to be those that are demonstrating our faith in the marketplace. Today, I want to take a little bit of a slightly different tangent on that and look a little bit more about the context of our work in the marketplace, the context of our mission in the marketplace, as we take a kind of a broad step back and ask ourselves the question, well, what is the nature of the kind of the environment in which we work? Because if we don't understand the nature of the environment in which we work, I think our message will lose relevancy with regards to what it is and how it is that we are to speak hope and speak wisdom and speak something that's useful to the people that are around us. And so this morning, the title of my message is Distraction Surplus and Attention Deficits. And you might ask yourself the question, well, what's that got to do with the context of the work in which we find ourselves in? But we live in an information era. We live in what's known as the knowledge economy. That's the context in which we work. And in fact, I bet that there are many here, and especially those of you who are online, that might even refer to yourselves as quote-unquote knowledge workers. We live in the tech industry. We work in the tech industry. And if we don't, we are certainly dealing with information all day long, every day. How many of us are kind of glued to our screens day by day, because what we do is so much determined by the machines that we interact with on a daily basis. There was a commencement address at Harvard University, recognizing that commencement address, particularly at Ivy League schools, are given by leaders in society who have this uncanny ability to be able to provide a kind of an inspirational take on what's going on in culture and how young graduates should be prepared to meet those challenges facing the culture. But there was a Harvard commencement speech back in 1943 by none other than the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill during the very midst of World War II. And he made this very interesting statement when he said, "The empires of the future are the empires of the mind." The empires of the future are the empires of the mind. A very insightful remark, given the fact that Churchill was fighting a war against a steely, industrial, militaristic universe, dealing with Germany, dealing with Japan, dealing with all of the other wannabe military installations that were fighting for control of humankind. At that time, Churchill had the audacity to say that the empires of the future are not going to be based on military might. They may not even be based on industrial strength. The empires of the future are the empires of the mind. Churchill understood that the fundamental nature of what lay behind the forces of change. It was not military might. It was not industrial muscle. But it was the manipulation of ideas, the domination of the mind by worldviews that offered empty promises of utopian economic futures. Fast forward 80 years later, and we see that Churchill was right. The political empires of Europe that once dominated the world via controls of the state and via the instrument of the industrial order, they have now been eclipsed by ideas, by mindsets, by an information age that rules over our economy today. Well, just like the financial economy, this knowledge economy is based on the foundation of personal choices, where you are free to create and you are free to consume what you will. And as Christians, this choice is accompanied by the expectation that we are to steward not only the material world that we live in, but also the mental resources that we have been given by God, the faculties of our mind that we are to use to generate value in other people's lives. Sadly, our fallen nature means that the resources not only of the material world, but the resources of our mind are all too often directed towards vanity rather than things that hold actual value. We're allured today into consuming information that lacks value and instead creates confusion. The quality of the information should be determined by its power to inform people into making wise and value-based decisions. But instead, we're bombarded every day through the constant attention of notifications that somebody's following me, notifications of a new message, notifications that apparently I am now liked. And I can rest assured and I can find a certain sense of attainment that somebody's watching me, somebody's liking me, somebody approves of what it is that I have done, even though it potentially is of very little value. The average person checks their phone, myself included probably, more than 60 times a day. And this pattern often results in what some refer to as the switch costs, where notifications impose a cost upon the task that we were ultimately distracted from. In economic terms, since this is a knowledge economy, in economic terms, information is therefore a form of currency with various levels of purchasing power. Information that is supplied in the digital economy is cheapened by an overabundant supply of fake news, clickbait, celebrity gossip, and so on and so forth that devalues the power of information. And with agenda-driven social media content and quote-unquote news that's flooding into the information market, it makes genuine understanding and wisdom a rare commodity in today's world. There's an inverse relationship between information abundance and wisdom scarcity, due to the fact that we only have limited capacity in our attention spans to actually process the information that we're receiving. Our attention is where information is processed. And that which is perceived in our attention span as being irrelevant is just discarded. Only that which is helpful to one's self-interest or our own selfish goals is kept in order to inform or justify the decisions and the actions, whether or not they happen to be good or bad. You see, we value certain things that we spend our attention on, but the question is are those things truly of value in terms of whether they bring glory to God and whether they bring value to other people. We must consider what we pay when we identify precisely what we are paying attention to. I love that phrase, paying attention, because do we understand the reality that when we give attention to something, we really do pay for it? We pay for it in terms of our time. We pay for it in terms of the affection that we are placing upon that piece of information. And we pay for it in terms of the consequence that it will reap in our lives or in the lives that we wish to benefit. Like our choice-based economic system, we must acknowledge that consumers and producers of knowledge are the ultimate decision makers that decide how to allocate the scarce resources of our attention. And as is the case with cheap and desirable material goods, the massive supply of sound bites, sensational narratives, fake news, and so on and so forth, they often provide cheap entertainment. The mind gravitates towards this cheap entertainment. Tom Nichols, in his book entitled The Death of Expertise, speaking of the sense that the ideas of experts now have been relegated to the dustbin. The death of expertise, he says, never have so many people had so much access to knowledge and yet have been so resistant to learning anything. It's a sad reality that we live in. And so in an era of distraction surplus and attention deficits, what we need is a godly intelligence. What I will argue this morning is what the world is looking for is true information content that has value. And what has value is knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. Wisdom is that prized possession that the world seemingly does not have the capacity to produce. No matter how much information we keep on spewing out into our economy, the reality is that we don't have the capacity to produce the rarest of commodities, and that is wisdom. And so this morning, the focus of what I want to gravitate towards this morning is how, as Christians living in this knowledge economy, how do we distinguish ourselves? And the answer to that question is by being those that are producers of wisdom that bring value to other people's lives that we encounter. Of course, as I have mentioned before in some of the other times that I have been here, I love to look for biblical examples of those who are in the Bible narrative, in the biblical story, that demonstrate this kind of idea. And the person that I turn to so often is the prophet Daniel. And the reason why I turn to him so often is because I think he, for us, embodies the same kind of not only mission that we're after, but lived in a kind of world that is very similar to the world in which we find ourselves today. It was a world, in reality, not dissimilar to ours, that was based on a knowledge economy. The Babylonian intellect was supreme to none. They valued and cherished the idea of information very, very highly indeed. They had these ideas of creating tablet houses, which to them were these massive libraries where they stored huge quantities of knowledge that they were accumulating about the universe, about science, about new technologies that they were creating, about architecture that they were building, and various different things that they were accumulating that they knew would be useful in terms of developing their empire that they were building around the world. These tablet houses stored enormous quantities of information. And the Babylonians certainly can still be credited to this day for giving us the foundation for mathematics and writing and sciences architecture and various different other things that are noted as a part of a great civilization, knowledge accumulation and knowledge dispersion was key to them. So much so that the Babylonian kings surrounded themselves with the elite of those most knowledgeable that would be able to serve the very agenda that the kings had in building the Babylonian Empire. Yet the reality was at the same time, despite this incredible accumulation, not only of economic wealth, but an economy of knowledge. Not only have they accumulated huge military power and prowess, but they had also built up this amazing structure of knowledge around them. And yet, we find that their leaders were among the most insecure of their time. It seems unfathomable that despite the accumulation of military power, political power throughout the then civilized worlds, and of course the intellectual prowess that they have built, that at the same time they struggled with the greatest amount of personal insecurity in their political leaders at that time. And of course, they were always on the search for more people that would be able to fill their intellectual systems, that would give them knowledge and understanding and so on and so forth. But very few of them had the capacity to bring about wisdom. And when the moments came, when the writing was on the wall in Babylon, when the empire was being shuttered by other systems around them that competed with them for that place of prominence. And despite the fact that they had gathered all of their elites, all of their most intellectual people into this grand banqueting hall where they were celebrating all the great accomplishments that Babylon had achieved, yet they couldn't understand the very writing that was on the wall. And it required the bringing forth of Daniel, who only he could understand the difficulties, understand the intricacies, and understand the problem. And in fact, his reputation was that he was a solver of problems. That as a result, he was invited in to define the writing that was on the wall. So we know that Daniel was a man of supreme understanding, but also one who had something different from everybody else, and that was the possession of wisdom. And so there's several principles that I want to just focus on this morning with regards to what it means to cultivate wisdom in an era when there is an abundance of knowledge. The first principle is possessing wisdom requires that we fear the source of knowledge. Not a fear where we're afraid, but a fear where we respect. Proverbs chapter 1 verse 7 says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge." And I think it's fundamental that we understand that, because the era of information, the era of knowledge in which we live, is an era where we are tearing down the value of all knowledge. We are tearing down the authority of all knowledge. We may have an abundance of knowledge, but the authority of knowledge is something that has been completely eradicated in our own era. And so for us, as we begin to move from, okay, well, what is it going to take for us to be not only knowledgeable people, but people that operate in wisdom, it must begin with a fundamental understanding that we recognize the authority of true knowledge that begins with the fear of the Lord being the one who is the fount of all knowledge and understanding. Man's pride comes with his own intelligence, that I am the author of what I know. I am the arbiter of espousing value or attributing value to what I know. I am the one who defines the essence of being able to define my own identity from what I know and forge my own destiny from what I know. But to embrace true wisdom is to embrace the fear of the Lord, who is the source of all knowledge. Adam ate of the tree of the knowledge of evil because he had an appetite to know what it was like to be God, what it was like to define identity, what it was like to define purpose, what it was like to define a future. Thank you, sweetheart. Appreciate that. And I think it's interesting as you look at Daniel as one who was so gifted in his wisdom. He also had an opportunity to restrict his capacity and his choice to just freely give himself to the consumption of what was available in the culture. I find it interesting that there is a correlation between when Daniel was offered all of the food from the king's table, everything that was available for him to eat was available to him in Babylon. And yet he made a decision in his heart to forego some of those things so that he would not be distracted by what the world would allure in the form of an entertainment. And it's interesting, on the heels of that as Daniel rejects the food from the king's table, that the very next thing that happens to him, Daniel chapter 1, verse 17, it talks about how God gives Daniel an understanding and a skill in the knowledge and the literature of the Babylonian people. There was something about, on one hand, limiting the focus so that we're not distracted by the world system, and instead given over to the ability to be able to receive the skill of understanding, knowledge, and wisdom in the midst of the world system. What is it that was so special about not eating from the king's table? I think it was by virtue of the fact that the reality was that the king's table was only offered to those who were serving in the king's court. In other words, what the king was doing there was wanting them to become entitled to the entrapment of high society. Become entitled to what the world has to offer in terms of its allurements. I'm not offering all of this wonderful opportunity to sit with me at my table to anybody, but I'm offering it to you because you are a part of the elite. You're a part of those who are becoming entitled. And that was something that Daniel wanted to resist. He didn't see himself as one who was entitled to what the world offered. And as a result of rejecting that entitlement, it opened him up to be able to receive a wisdom not of this world, but yet a wisdom that was still relevant to being in that world. Secondly, possessing wisdom is a gift we must learn to receive. Wisdom is not a product necessarily of a 4-year college degree. Wisdom is not the product necessarily of completing your MBA. Wisdom is something that is given to us by God. And yes, it does require hard work. And yes, it does require discipline. Yes, it does require wisdom. It does require reading. But it is something that is a gift from God. In verse 17 there, it says, God gave Daniel knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom. It doesn't say that Daniel learned knowledge and wisdom. It says God gave Daniel knowledge and wisdom. The word gave there is to cause to receive. Now, it's true that in receiving something, we must reach out in order to be able to receive it. It's not just something that just kind of lands on us. There is the work that is required of receiving. But at the same time, it is a gift that is given. It's not something that is necessarily just given because you have a natural aptitude to understanding, knowledge, and wisdom. And I know this for a fact because that is something that I struggle with in school. To this day, I sometimes pull out my report cards from school just as a reminder to me that whatever knowledge or wisdom or understanding I think I have is a gift from God. Because when I was in school, I was the kid that was getting C's and D's. And it was only by the grace of God that He taught me, and by exposure to others in my life who showed me what a disciplined lifestyle was in terms of learning, so that we can attain a level of understanding. Thirdly, wisdom requires mastery in our thinking. I think that builds upon what I was just saying. That yes, it is a gift, but it is a gift that requires mastery. It's a gift that requires the ability to hone and to apply it to the specific people and the specific instances that we find that God is giving us an opportunity to serve. In Daniel chapter 2, he describes a situation after having been given again a solution to the king's problem. And Daniel's declaration is that God gives wisdom, what? To the simple? No. God gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. That would seem a little unfair. I was hoping for a kind of a more of a socialist understanding of wisdom, where God just kind of gives wisdom just kind of regardless of our status, regardless of our efforts. No, God gives wisdom, but He gives wisdom to those who are wise. Not necessarily wise in the world's eyes, but wise enough to understand that wisdom comes through the focused mind of discipline. A mind that is free from the distractions of the world. In an era of distraction, to obtain mastery in our thinking, disciplined thinking habits must be cultivated through a number of different things. I'm just going to give you a handful of them. Number one, a passion for truth. It seems ironic that in an information era, though we have undermined the notion that there can be truth. I mean, talk about one of the reasons why perhaps we have so much disillusionment in a society where we live and breathe in information, and yet there is no truth. How can that be? That must produce such a level of insecurity in us, where we're surrounded by information all day, every day, and yet we have no idea what is true. We must have and believe, not only have a passion for, but maybe we need to start with that we have a belief that there is a truth. Secondly, teachableness. We need to be internally teachable. Teachable is not just, I'm called to be an architect, and so I'm going to study, the details of architecture. I'm not just talking about that, although that obviously is necessary. Teachableness is a willingness to receive in humility what we need to know about ourselves. A wise person is one who is teachable, one who is constantly looking for the clues of feedback from other people and adjusting accordingly. The way that I said something there, that made that person shut down. And so I need to adjust how I present information to them. Here's another one that I think that perhaps we need to adhere to that is very difficult for us in our day and era. Silence and solitude. How difficult is it for you to turn your phone even onto mute, let alone to turn it off from time to time. I find it very hard. FOMO, the fear of missing out, the fear that we might miss something important. But there needs to be those, and I'm not saying that we should be a hermit, I'm not saying that we should abandon our technology, far from it, but in an era where we're being constantly bombarded from these things, we need to have those times and those seasons, whether it's even just 1 hour in the morning or whether it's late at night, whatever it is, we need to have those times where there's silence, where we are shielding ourselves from the noise of society. And this next one goes right along with it. Concentration and focused attention. I don't know about you, but part of my job is to give real deep thought to what needs to be communicated in writing, whether it's an important email that I'm writing or whether it's a paper that I'm writing. Okay? And it is incredibly difficult to do that when, you've got Outlook on one side with the emails that are pouring in. You've got your watch here that's telling you the latest, notification that you need. And the constant strain is to check that. Look at this. See what's happening here. Something just drove by the house outside. What was that? The incredible ability to concentrate with focused attention is something that is incredibly difficult in this day and era. And so we need to get good at saying it's okay to shrink down my Outlook. It's okay to take off the watch. It's okay to put the phone into silence. I'll get back to those people later. The last point that I want to focus just on there with regards to just a practical thing, reading that directs thinking. In an era of distraction, to obtain mastery in our thinking, reading is something that will direct our thinking. We've replaced reading with scrolling. We think that just by scrolling, we will get informed of all that is necessary to keep up with our little world that we live in. Scroll, 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 like, scroll, 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 love, scroll, 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 smiley face. Okay. And there is a time, there is place for that. There is a necessity for that to one degree or another. But we need to put boundaries around those things in our lives and give ourselves time for reading that really enables us to get into deep thinking. The last major point that I want to deal with that helps us to build wisdom is that we must apply truth by creating value. Wisdom is given to those that are giving to others. And so if that's the case, then we need to be those that are constantly giving wisdom to others in ways that provide them with value. Proverbs 8, verse 5, kings reign and rulers decree by justice. By wisdom, princes rule and nobles and judges and all the earth. So my question to you is whatever capacity that you find yourself leading, whatever decisions that you find making in the kingdom of your own life, whether that's your family, whether that's your team, whether that's the company you work for, or whatever it is, whatever degree of influence that God has given you to steward and to manage. The question is are you doing that by wisdom? Are you applying wisdom and using wisdom to create value in the field that God has called you to serve within? For those of you who are in who are knowledge workers or who are in the business of capturing the attention of others to encourage them to buy your product, I ask you this question. Somebody is about to spend their attention on what it is that you have to say. Will you leave their attention in better condition than before you spoke to them? Or will you leave them in attention that is more confused, more fearful? Or will you leave them and their attention in a place where they feel like that they are valued? Or that what you produce is something that's going to bring them not perceived benefit, but real benefit? So for those of us who work in the field of knowledge, it's not good enough that we are just passing information from one hand to another, just as the financial economy passes a dollar bill from one person to another, and we are responsible to make sure that the velocity of money continues to speed up and moves out and spreads and generates wealth and is maybe, depending on your economic worldview, distributed to others. In the same way, in the knowledge economy, we also are responsible for the producing of information that is distributed to other people. The question, though, has to be is the information we are passing on to other people generating value in the lives in which it's being received? So as we close this morning, yes, this is a message about focusing our concentration in times where we are so easily distracted. But I find more often than not that generally I am not particularly excited about focusing on the things that we shouldn't do. Shouldn't be on social media as much. Shouldn't be on Facebook as much. Shouldn't be scrolling through YouTube as much. Shouldn't be liking things on Instagram as much. Shouldn't be binging the latest series on Netflix as much. All the things that we shouldn't do. Instead, perhaps we should focus on what it is that we should be doing. Because I think as Christians, we do tend to isolate ourselves and almost make ourselves irrelevant because our focus is on the things that we should not do. The question should be, is what should we do that is producing and creating and generating value in other people? So rather than just scrolling on Facebook, I know I find this a huge challenge, but actually commenting on Facebook, create value, give a response to somebody. And of course, that's a relatively trivial example. But when it comes to our work, thinking about not just how am I contributing information to a situation, but how am I contributing wisdom to a situation. Because I believe what the world is craving for in this era of an abundance of information is true wisdom. And as James says, wisdom is not something that is derived on this plane. It's derived from above, which means that you and I have the access to a fount of wisdom the world knows not what of. But when they taste it, they are benefited by it. Because the wisdom of God is available as a blessing to all. That's the common grace of biblical wisdom that is of tremendous benefit to all of society, whether or not they believe him, whether or not they believe ultimately in salvation. The benefit of God's wisdom to society is that it produces life and hope and meaning and value. So, as we end this morning, Let's be those that ask the question, not only how am I spending my attention, but also what am I producing in terms of things that are going to capture the attention of others that are going to generate value for them as a human being. Let's pray. Father, we thank you this morning for your grace. We thank you that no matter what our backgrounds, no matter what our education, no matter how entrenched we are in this world, that, Lord, that we can present ourselves to you as recipients of the grace of wisdom. That we understand that wisdom is a grace. It is something that we are not worthy of. The wisdom of your word, the wisdom of truths that are unfathomable to us. That no matter how much Ivy League education we may have received, that there is nothing in this world system that qualifies us to receive the kind of wisdom that you desire to impart to us. And so we stand in that reality in hope, because we know that you are an amazing God who desires to give that to us regardless of whether we are so-called qualified to do so in the world's eyes. We are qualified to walk in understanding. We are qualified to walk in knowledge. We are qualified to walk in understanding. And we realize that those things, those attributes may not necessarily be of anything that we have deserved ourselves. But we do also recognize, Lord, that they require a measure of, not sure if I even want to use the word work, but it is a work. But it's not a work that is striving. It's the work of receiving from you. It's the work of putting ourselves in a posture of discipline where we can receive those things from you. And so, Lord, with all the distractions, with all the abundance of information, with all of the constant notifications that we find ourselves surrounded by, help us, Lord, to be able to maintain our focus. Amidst all those things that we still need to make ourselves available to, that we can't just switch off from life. We can't just turn off our life and put our life on just a kind of a secret vibrate. We've got to be present. We've got to be in the world. But help us, Lord, to be in the world in a way that we can define, that we can draw limits around, in such a way where we can still be in that place of quietness, where we can focus on things that are truly of value. So, Lord, help us in that this morning, we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.